Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our program exploring discoveries from the Shapell roster, the Washington, D.C. area edition, with Adrian DeArmas and Caitlin Winkler. Before we continue, I would like to thank Bethel Hebrew Congregation in Alexandria, Virginia, for helping bring this lecture to our community. And I will now welcome Rabbi David Spinrad, the rabbi at Bethel, who will share a few words at this time. Welcome, Rabbi.
Thank you, Matthew. Friends, it's good to be together during this incredibly difficult hour. And as we begin, where I really believe is going to be an enlightening conversation, I'd like to offer a prayer for Israel in a time of war. Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu v'Imotenu, the God of our ancestors, you know that the Jewish people are one nation with one heart, and our hearts have been broken now for over a month. The difficult news of so many of our sisters, our brothers, our Jewish family killed, wounded, and kidnapped, we turn to you. Harofeh Lishburei Lev, O healer of broken hearts, binder of our wounds, be with our family who've been taken captive, along with the families of the victims. Watch over the hostages, break their bonds, bring them out from darkness unto light. As Isaiah proclaim release to the captives, liberation to the imprisoned. Comfort the families of all those who have been taken from them. Bring them under the shelter of your nurturing wings. Bring complete healing of body and spirit to each of the wounded. Bind up our wounds. Grant us healing. Sur Yisrael, Bagoalo, rock and redeemer of the people Israel. Bless Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel, the initial manifestation of our ultimate redemption. Shield it with your care, spread over it your Sukkot Shlomecha, your shelter of sacred peace. Guide its leaders and its advisors with your light and your truth. Grace them with your good counsel. Strengthen the hands of those who defend the Jewish homeland. Crown their efforts with victory. Bless the land with peace, its inhabitants with lasting joy. Shomer Yisrael, guardian of Israel, strengthen and bless the defenders of Israel, who stand guard over our land, on the land, in the air, and on the sea. Deliver their murderers into their hands. May we see the promise of the psalmist. You turn my mourning into dancing, my sackcloth into robes of joy. Holy God, protect and serve and restore peace and well-being to Israel, your land, and your people. As together we say, Amen.
Amen. Thank you for such moving and powerful words, Rabbi. Before moving on to tonight's program, I want to highlight our next two lectures briefly. They're actually interrelated with our conversation tonight. Next week, we'll explore the complicated legacy of slavery within Jewish texts. Narratives of slavery sit at the heart of our Jewish tradition and ancient Jewish stories, such as the Exodus, and they continue to inform our lives today. And although this program tonight is not about slavery in particular, slavery clearly played a role during the Civil War, to say the least. This theme of subjugation and freedom and opportunity continues on December 4th with a discussion of Julius Rosenwald, who was the son of German Jewish immigrants. He became a leading philanthropist and provided significant funding to build nearly 5,000 schools for African American children throughout the South. This effort has actually been called by some the most important initiative to advance Black education in the 20th century. So we look forward to those two programs, and you can check out our website for more details. As usual, I'd like to encourage you all to actively participate and engage as much as possible. So please feel free to ask questions and share your thoughts. We've actually the chat should also be open, so you can share maybe thoughts there and make sure your questions are in the Q&A. And so on to our speakers tonight. Caitlin Winkler is a researcher for the Shapell roster. She joined the project in 2012, straight out of law school, as an on-site researcher at the National Archives. She has a JD from Washington and Lee University and a BA in Historic Preservation from the University of Mary Washington. She previously interned with the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the Land Trust of Virginia, before she parlayed her legal research skills into the life of history detective work. Adrienne Diarmas is the director of the Shapell roster. She joined the Shapell Manuscript Foundation in 2011, bringing over 25 years of experience in primary source historical document research, database and digital asset management, and storytelling to this digital history resource. She has an MA in Museum Studies from George Washington University and a BA in Anthropology from Emory University. Her previous clients and employers include the Smithsonian Institution, the Historical Society of Washington, D.C., and Time Magazine. We had the opportunity to welcome Adrienne Diarmas last December, along with Professor Mendelsohn, for a lecture and conversation on the Shapell roster and the Jewish soldiers of the Union Army. This evening's program will allow us to go deeper into the individual stories of those who lived in the Washington, D.C. area, and also teach us how to use the roster for our own research. So without further ado, I invite Adrienne and Caitlin to take the virtual stage. Thank you for joining us today.
On behalf of the Shapell Manuscript Foundation, I want to thank Becky Levy, Matt Silverman, Vanya Young-Garber at the Haberman Institute for inviting us back to talk more about the Shapell roster, and all of you for joining us today. I'm Adrienne Diarmas, the director of the Shapell roster, and with me this evening is one of our senior researchers, Caitlin Winkler. Alex Apito was unable to join us due to a death in the family, so we send our condolences to her. Before we get started on introducing you to some of our favorite Civil War veterans from the DC metro area, I want to talk briefly about the organization behind this new digital history resource. Benjamin Shapell established the Shapell Manuscript Foundation in 2005 as an independent educational organization dedicated to collecting and exhibiting original manuscripts, historical documents, and objects. Today, it produces groundbreaking research, articles, exhibitions, documentary films, videos, and books like Lincoln and the Jews by Dr. Jonathan Sarna and Benjamin Shapell, and most recently, Adam Mendelsohn's 2-volume set, Jewish Soldiers in the Civil War. Volume 1, published by NYU Press last year, focused on the Union Army, and Volume 2, which is currently being written, will focus on the Confederacy. Ben's passion for history is the driving force behind everything the foundation does. His carefully curated collection, more than 40 years in the making, spans 2 centuries and collectively reveals the human side of history. His vision for the Shapell roster, to create a publicly accessible and historically accurate accounting of Jewish participation in the American Civil War, is why we are here today. What is the Shapell roster? In short, the Shapell roster of Jewish service in the American Civil War is an ongoing reappraisal of the military service of Jews in the Civil War. Our goal was to identify every Jewish soldier and sailor who served in the Civil War. Our process is to find primary source evidence of both military service and Judaism for each name in Simon Wolf's The American Jew as Patriot, Soldier, and Citizen, and the numerous names he omitted. Our purpose is to change the conversation from how many to a more personalized and in-depth story of Jewish participation in an extraordinary period in American history. The result is a free to the public online database and published content drawn from that data. The database contains more than 50 searchable fields of data, nearly 10,000 soldier records, a bibliography of more than 2,500 primary and secondary sources, and more than 50,000 historical documents. The interpretive content includes scholarly articles on shapell.org, social media posts, and video presentations like this. While the goal of the Shapell roster has never wavered since its inception, the process, purpose, and result have evolved in response to the wealth of information we continue to discover. How did the idea for the Shapell roster come to be? To answer that, we have to go back to 1895, when a Washington, D.C. based lawyer named Simon Wolfe published a book called The American Jew as Patriot, Soldier, and Citizen. Written in response to a growing wave of general anti-Semitism and published allegations that Jews were not willing to fight for their country. It includes more than 8,000 names of, purportedly, Jewish soldiers and sailors who served in the American Civil War. Since then, the general consensus among Jewish historians has been that if not every name in Wolfe's roster was Jewish, that number was so small as to not be noteworthy. And yet, it proved to be an unreliable reference tool for, say, someone like Ben Shapell, who was building a collection that included Civil War era manuscripts. In order to create a solid foundation for the future study of American Jewish history, Wolfe's 19th century work needed a 21st century upgrade. To that end, we've determined that nearly 1,000 and counting of the names in Wolfe's roster are not Jewish, and we've added more than 1,500 names that he omitted. In August of 2022, the Shapell roster went live with the records of Union soldiers and sailors. We are currently working on the Confederacy and will launch those records at a later date. As you might imagine, it takes time to find the soldiers and sailors in the historical record, collect the documents, and populate each soldier page with the data we find. Given the results of the Civil War, you might not be surprised to learn that finding military records for all the Jewish Confederates is sometimes challenging. And to say that Wolfe missed more Confederates than Union men is an understatement. While 12% of the Union soldiers and sailors in the Shapell roster are names we've discovered, to date, 31% of the total number of Confederates we're working on were not in Wolfe's roster at all. Speaking of numbers, allow me to address the most often asked question we received. How many Jews served in the Civil War? The reality is that answer changes every single day. Between new additions, finding new evidence that a name from Wolfe was Jewish, the Shapell roster is constantly being updated. How do we do what we do? We like to say carefully and collaboratively. We have two mandates: obtain proof of military service and evidence a soldier was Jewish. As I'm sure you know all too well, some resources are better than others. People often ask us what our favorite resource is, and we all agree. For military service, the records at the National Archives. For proving someone was Jewish, descendants. Once we accomplish that, we collect the following data for each soldier and sailor, if available: date and location for birth and death, marriage, residence, and occupation details, the connections, if any, between him and other individuals in the database, and historical documents that provide insight into his life before, during, and after the war. Much more than a military roll of honor, the Shapell roster soldier pages contain the carefully collected details of their lives and our favorite feature, the connections between them. Whether they married a fellow soldier's sister, maintained a lifelong friendship with someone they once shared a tent with, or served with their brothers, fathers, and cousins. After more than a decade of being immersed in their lives, I can tell you that not every one of them left footprints in the historical record, but when they did, we found them to be brave heroes and cowardly deserters, pillars of their communities and criminals. And while some died much too young, many others were celebrated centenarians. Getting to know each and every one of them has been a privilege and a pleasure, as is being here with you today. Thank you. And now I'm going to turn it over to Caitlin, who gets to do the fun part of the presentation. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. The first soldier we're going to discuss tonight is Leopold Blumenberg. Blumenberg is a great to track in the Shapell roster. Blumenberg was a high-ranking officer, an achievement we like to look out for as evidence of our soldiers' military prowess and achievement, as well as respect and appreciation from their peers and superiors. Blumenberg was also a veteran of the 48 revolutions in Europe, which is true of many of our high-ranking officers. These men took their prior experience in the war from their home countries and put it to good use fighting for their adopted nation. To learn more about Jewish 48ers in the Civil War, we have a series of articles on the Shapell website. I highly recommend. Leopold Blumenberg was born in Prussia in 1827. He came to America in 1854 after serving as a private in the Prussian army during the First Schleswig War. He settled in Baltimore and ran a manufacturing business while supporting abolitionist causes and becoming an ardent Republican. Following the start of the Civil War, Blumenberg enlisted in the 5th Maryland Infantry as captain of Company C. He was then promoted to major of the regiment only a few weeks later because of his efficacy in raising troops. Apparently, his success was noticed by men on all sides of the war. Pro-slavery citizens attempted to hang Blumenberg because of his recruitment numbers, and it was necessary for several days that he be guarded to prevent further threats. Blumenberg's military career came to a halt after he was severely wounded at the Battle of Antietam. According to one newspaper account, Blumenberg was leading his regiment in a charge on the rebel rifle pits when he was struck in the thigh by an English explosive bullet from a Confederate sharpshooter. It took some months for Blumenberg's resignation to be accepted because of the lack of a suitable replacement for the major, but his field days were at an end. Blumenberg's service to this country, however, was not. Following his discharge from the 5th Maryland, Blumenberg was appointed by one President Abraham Lincoln to serve as the Provost Marshal for the 3rd District of Maryland, headquartered in Baltimore. This turned out to be a tough job, enforcing the Union draft in a city often loyal to the other side. In January 1865, Blumenberg was removed from office by the Provost Marshal General, in spite of the earlier Provost Marshal General's dismissal order being, quote, by discretion of the president. It seems Lincoln knew nothing about it. He wrote a reply to this order asking Secretary of War Edwin Stanton to look into the matter and, quote, ascertain and let me know what is the particular cause of the removal, because it was, quote, likely to give me a good deal of trouble. Lincoln wrote a second time, suggesting Blumenberg should at least have a hearing before being dismissed, stating Blumenberg, quote, has suffered for us and served us well, had the rope around his neck for being our friend, raised troops and fought and been wounded. He should not be dismissed in a way that disgraces and ruins him without a hearing. Stanton did investigate and reported to Lincoln that Blumenberg's strict and sometimes corporal enforcement of conscription laws had made him unpopular with the locals. He was even accused of gagging men to make them confess they were deserters. So Blumenberg's dismissal as provost marshal stood, but Lincoln continued to support the Prussian, appointing Blumenberg to a new position as superintendent of the warehouse at the Baltimore Custom House. After the war, President Andrew Johnson awarded Blumenberg the ranks of lieutenant colonel, colonel, and brigadier general by brevet for gallant and meritorious services. He died 11 years after the Civil War ended at only age 49. His life ended early, likely in part due to the ongoing complications from the wound he received at Antietam. Blumenberg was buried in Baltimore's Har-Sinai Cemetery. To read more about Leopold Blumenberg, I highly recommend you check out Lincoln and the Jews by Jonathan Sarna and Ben Shapell. Louis Mundheim was born in 1832 in Hanover and came to Washington, D.C. in 1855 to carve out a better life for himself and his parents and younger sisters. His father, Simon Mundheim, was a rabbi and worked for Washington Hebrew congregation after he joined his son in D.C. When the Civil War broke out, Mundheim was one of the earliest to enlist, joining the 8th Battalion D.C. Militia as a private. His obituary claims he, quote, went to the front and was promoted to a captaincy and was in several engagements. This appears to be a bit of an embellishment. The 8th Battalion was organized for the protection of the city and did not participate in any battles before being mustered out in July of 1861. He basically spent the whole time in D.C. And Louis Mundheim is not found to receiving a higher rank than private in the muster rolls as well. This false promotion may have been due to some confusion caused by Mundheim's prominence and honorary ranks in different veterans organizations after the war. He served as commander of Lafayette Post 20 of the Grand Army of the Republic, or GAR, and was also a member of the Hebrew Union Veterans Association. The latter organization is where this fantastic portrait of Mundheim comes from. The Hebrew Union Veterans Association, or HUVA, was founded in 1896 by different prominent Jewish members of the GAR. The GAR was a huge fraternal organization for veterans of the Union Army, which, along with providing veterans a great social outlet, helped support and care for sick veterans and sponsored Memorial Day services, celebrations, and monuments. While many Jewish veterans were members of the GAR, there were never enough Jewish members in any one post to support holding a Memorial Day service in a synagogue. The HUVA formed to change that, becoming the first and only veterans organization in America also associated with a religion. After the Spanish-American War, the organization broadened to accept other veterans, changing its name to the Jewish Veterans of the Wars of the Republic. The organization still exists today as the longest-standing veterans organization in the United States and is now called the simpler Jewish War Veterans of the United States. The JWV continues to advocate for the rights of service members and veterans, and we have been very proud to work closely with their museum, the National Museum of American Jewish History, located in DuPont Circle. To learn more about the Hebrew Union Veterans Association, I definitely encourage you to check out the videos of our presentations with the museum available online on our YouTube channel. One of our favorite features of the Shapell roster is our soldier connections. Being able to discover how our soldiers interacted with each other, fought together, were related to each other, etc., is always fascinating and gives us a little insight into life as a whole for them. Leopold Karpeles was a native of Prague, born in 1838. He immigrated to the United States in his late teens and lived in Brownsville, Texas, New York City, and finally Springfield, Massachusetts before the war broke out. He served in the 46th Massachusetts Militia Infantry and the 57th Massachusetts Infantry as a private, and eventually was promoted to sergeant in the latter regiment. His connection to this area appears to have its genesis during the Civil War. Karpeles was wounded badly at the Battle of North Anna and sent to Mount Pleasant General Hospital in D.C. to recover. Once deemed recovered, Karpeles was sent back out in the field, but quickly fell ill again due to the harsh conditions on the march and was returned to Mount Pleasant. As his condition worsened, this time he was sent to the home of one Louis Mundheim, our previous soldier, to be nursed by the family. It is unclear exactly how Karpeles became acquainted with the Mundheims. We believe the sisters may have been acting as nurses in the hospital, but the family took him in, and the bond he formed with them was clearly strong as he married Sarah Mundheim, Louis's sister, a year later, and then after Sarah's death was married to another sister, Henrietta, by their father, Rabbi Simon Mundheim. After his first marriage, Karpeles remained in D.C. for the rest of his life, working first as a milliner and then for the post office. Karpeles was awarded the Medal of Honor in 1870 for his actions at the Battle of North Anna. His commendation states he received the medal, quote, for extraordinary heroism on the 6th of May, 1864, while serving with Company E, 57th Massachusetts Infantry, in action during the Wilderness Campaign, Virginia, while color bearer Sergeant Karpeles rallied the retreating troops and induced them to check the enemy's advance. At this time, the process to be awarded the Medal of Honor was very different than it is today. First created during the Civil War, a person could nominate themselves for it, which is what Karpeles did. A successful application typically required the endorsement of commanding officers and comrades, but the process was made more selective over time, with a number of Civil War-era medals being revoked in 1917. After it was determined many recipients did not rise to the required level to receive such an award. Karpeles' medal stood intact, however, and based on the account provided to him by his second lieutenant, one John Anderson, one can see why. Anderson recalled to Karpeles Yes, Carpeles, I remember you at the Battle of North Anna. I remember that you carried the colors of the glorious old 57th far beyond any other colors. Your bravery was conspicuous. I remember that you fell badly wounded. Another sergeant was sent to take the colors from you, but you refused to give them up and carried them forward until loss of blood or another wound compelled you to give them into the hands of another. I remember all of this distinctly as I felt justly proud of you, a sergeant in Company E. Carpeles is one of 5 Jewish Civil War soldiers we have been able to confirm who were awarded the Medal of Honor. A 6th Jewish Civil War soldier was also awarded the Medal of Honor for his later actions during the Indian campaigns. To read more about Carpeles, check out Adam Mendelssohn's Jewish Soldiers in the Civil War, the Union Army. David Mendez Cohen is our only American-born soldier, or more specifically, Marine, that we will be discussing today. The majority of our Jewish Union soldiers, sailors, and Marines were foreign-born. We are eager to see if the same proves true in the South. Cohen was actually born in Norfolk, Virginia, so he, unlike Robert E. Lee, chose to remain in U.S. service and stay loyal to his country despite the feelings of his home state. Born in 1826, the son of an 1812 veteran and the great nephew of a Revolutionary War veteran, Cohen was determined to serve his country from the start. It took a while for the Marine to obtain the position he sought, however. Cohen was finally commissioned as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Marine Corps in 1855 at age 29. He was promoted to first lieutenant a month before the Civil War began in March 1861 and would continue in the service until 1869 when his retirement was approved by President Ulysses S. Grant. By that time, Cohen had reached the rank of major despite a bit of a penchant for trouble. Cohen was tried by court-martial on 3 separate occasions for foul language, disrespect to a commanding officer, drunkenness on duty, and once for challenging the son of the naval commandant of Mare Island to a duel. So he's a fun guy. While Cohen's records with the judge advocate proved to be an interesting read, Cohen's experience during the Civil War was relatively mundane. Already in his mid-30s when the war broke out, he was relegated primarily to administrative duties, keeping the U.S. Marine Corps running behind the scenes as the conflict dragged on. But Cohen was on a mailboat called the Ariel when it was captured by the notorious CSS Alabama, a sloop of war assigned to raid any and all Union merchant ships it could find, pictured here. Crew members of the Alabama recalled that Cohen, then a captain, particularly bristled when the Confederates ordered the Union Marines to surrender and stack their arms. But upon being reminded of their current proximity to numerous Alabama ports unfriendly to Union officers, Cohen eventually capitulated and ordered his men to disarm. The incident, while interesting to us, did not even make Cohen's official military records, nor did he or his family members mention it when applying for pensions. After retirement, Cohen remained in New York City, where he had worked on and off throughout his career in the Marines. He was married in his 50s by one Rabbi Jacobs and had a daughter, Lily, who would go on to marry Frederick Lewis, a naval officer similar to her father. Herman Arthur Seligson, like Leopold Blumenberg, was a Prussian native and a veteran of the Prussian army. Born in 1843 and 16 years Blumenberg's junior, however, he played no part in the revolutions of 1848. After receiving an education at the military academy at Potsdam and serving briefly in the Prussian artillery, Seligson came to America and landed with a cousin living in Burlington, Vermont. When war broke out, he enlisted early as a private in the 1st Vermont Infantry in May 1861, a 3-month regiment. The next year, Seligson received a commission as 1st lieutenant in the 9th Vermont Infantry, was promoted to captain after another 7 months, and was eventually granted the rank of lieutenant colonel in the summer of 1865. Yes, you're doing the math. This was after the war had ended. The 9th Vermont remained in Virginia on provost duty until the end of December 1865. Seligson was singled out for his military education, his organizational capabilities, and his commitment to order and discipline. At different times during his service, Seligson was assigned assistant provost marshal and act as an assistant inspector general, all of which he did with great distinction. After the war, Seligson moved to Washington, D.C. and settled in Georgetown. He sold musical instruments and then received an appointment to the Census Bureau. Unlike other men we've discussed this evening who openly practiced their Jewish faith, it was much harder to confirm Seligson's religion. He had no religious association in Burlington we could find, and there certainly was not much of a Jewish community to speak of there when Seligson was a resident. In DC, which as we've seen had a thriving Jewish community in his time, Seligson met a Miss Alice K. Hood, who was not Jewish, and they were married at Holy Trinity Catholic Church in Georgetown by a Father Stone Street. Upon his death, Seligson received the great honor of being buried in Arlington National Cemetery, appropriate for one of his rank and with such DC connections. None of this helped our cause until we noticed a line in his obituary, which we then corroborated with his death certificate. Seligson died in a hotel in Baltimore while staying there for business. According to the write-up, after his death, Seligson's secretary went to Baltimore to make arrangements and, quote, had the body removed to Jacob Ahern's and Company's. Fortunately for us, Jacob Ahern's was a prominent Jewish funeral home in Baltimore at that time. And Seligson's death certificate confirmed it was indeed who prepared the body. So we were finally able to confirm that Seligson was indeed Jewish and put that question to rest. So that's all the stories I have for you tonight. I definitely encourage you to go read more about these men and others of the Shapell roster. Use our database to find your ancestors or read about soldiers new to you highlighted on the roster homepage. Peruse and see some of the amazing documents and narratives we've collected over the past decade plus. And please reach out to us. We want to hear from you if you're a descendant and you found your ancestor. Let's talk about him. If you're a descendant and we don't have your ancestor, then we really want to add him. If you think you might be a descendant, but you are having trouble searching, we're here to help. And if you're interested in the project and would like to volunteer, we'd love to talk with you. Also, if you want to share items from your family's collection with us relating to your Civil War ancestor, we would be honored. And also, if you're a Confederate descendant, we still want to talk to you. You can't access those records yet, but we are happy to share with you what we have. And we definitely want to make sure he's included when the Confederate records go live. Also, really quickly, I wanted to thank our veterans and service members since it's almost Veterans Day. Thank you for your service. Okay, now let's have some Q&A.
Thank you, Adrienne and Caitlin. It's such a wonderful and fascinating, engaging stories to hear. So for all of you out there, you can go ahead now, and if you have any questions or if you want to put anything in the chat about your own stories or your family stories, please do so now. To get us started, you mentioned that I think it was David Mendez Cohen was from Norfolk, but he didn't join the Southern Army. What I imagine, I don't know, this question hasn't come up, but I imagine it's a question that others might wonder: how many people in general did that decide, or how many were just stayed in the,
I think
where
the
they
last
lived?
time we ran the numbers to see, because this is kind of a narrative we've been tracking, we're really interested in seeing those patterns, seeing what Southern-born Americans decided to serve for the Union, and then we're also looking at what Union, Northern-born Americans decided to serve in the South. And we definitely want to do a comparison once we have all of that. But the last time we ran the numbers, we have like 12 Union soldiers who were born in the South, which isn't a huge number, but it's not an insignificant number either. I think my favorite of those, aside from Cohen, are the Alfred Mordecais. It was a father and a son who were high-ranking officers in the U.S. Army before the Civil War broke out. And the father resigned and was like, I can't fight against my home, not doing it. And the son graduated from West Point with Custer and went on to have this like thriving career throughout the Civil War and was a hero of the Union Army. So it was had to be an interesting dinner table conversation later, but I I love that sort of thread and the different feelings of the generations.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I lost my thought there. Yeah, it's definitely all very interesting to me. And I see that there's, when my thought comes back, I'll go back to it, but I see there's some more questions that have come in here. How did the soldiers maintain a religiously Jewish life during their terms in service? Is there any sense of, or if they did maintain Jewish practice and ritual during their times of service?
I mean, we definitely have some examples, but what we have found, and Caitlin, you can, as the wife of someone in the military, you can speak to this, contemporarily, but I really don't think much has changed. It's hard to multitask when you're being shot at, when your feet hurt and you're cold and you're hungry. It's really hard not to focus on not being killed and, doing all of the things you need to do as a soldier. So, Caitlin, feel free.
Yeah, we have some examples of guys where we have like men who are killed in action. We have the list of their surviving objects that are being sent home to their families. And sometimes they'll say, oh, there was a Jewish prayer book, or there was, these observant pieces. It's not normally super specific because the people who are doing these inventories don't know what the items
Right.
are.
Mhm.
So we're sort of piecing it together. But you don't see a ton of talk about that. There are like the mythology behind like the last Seder of the Confederacy and things like that that sort of keep getting talked about. And you will see men getting passes to attend a relative's bar mitzvah. I've seen that, which is really cool. Or men getting a pass to go in. Like we have a guy who was, I think it was in Nashville, somewhere in
Yeah.
Tennessee. I want to say it was Nashville. It might have been Murfreesboro, but I think it was Nashville. And he got a pass to go attend synagogue services because he said to a commanding officer, "Hey, I'm nearby the synagogue. I haven't been near a synagogue in months and months and months. You have to let me go to services, things like that." But those are few and far between. And I think what Adrian was alluding to is these are mostly 18, 19-year-old, 20-year-old guys, and religion doesn't seem to have necessarily been their number one priority at that point in time. And you see a lot of these men get more observant over time and more involved in their religious practice from what documents are still extant. So,
Yeah.
Right.
Matt, I wanted to address something that showed up in the chat about Simon Wolf's 1895 roster. Just a correction. Simon Wolf and I'm blanking on Levy's name, the guy he worked with.
Eugene Levy
Eugene
is the
Levy, right.
Confederate guy he worked with. Yes.
Right. They actually worked on this for many years, not a couple of months. I mean, we have evidence in newspapers over the span of many years asking for
Yeah. They were
names.
publishing ads across the country saying, hey, if you were Jewish and you served, or if you know people who are Jewish and they served, please, contact us, tell us your information. And they were really trying to be as
Yes.
expansive in their search as they could. It just obviously technology had its limitations at that point in time.
And we know that at the time, Simon Wolf had a job as the recorder of deeds for the District of Columbia. And we don't have proof of this, but we do have some evidence that he had access to documents that he had that other people might not have. So, for example, some of the mistakes that we have found in Wolf's roster, there's pretty strong evidence that he had a peak at the 1890 veteran census, because there's two guys who are listed on the 1890 veteran census. They're listed as living in Kentucky, because that's where so they're listed in his book as serving from Kentucky. They were living in Kentucky, but we found them serving in Tennessee. So
In
there was
Ohio, yeah, in Cincinnati.
right. There was a lot of work that went into, and Wolf, he reached out to the GAR. He asked high-ranking officers who were in DC, tell me, and one of the, going back to what you were saying, Caitlin, about the mythology, Isaac Cohen, who served in the 8th New York State Militia, there was an article published in, was it the Israelite or the Messenger? I don't remember which, about, this moment on the battlefield. And when he read it, he was like, no, that never happened. So, we're constantly like balancing the mythology with what's the evidence in the historical record. But I did want to point out that Simon Wolf he really did an outstanding job. We're huge fans. I just can't believe that he was able to get as much right as he did, with no access to the technology that we have. Impressive.
Right. No, for sure.
Yeah, your what you just said there reminded me of my original thought, which was sort of like how you balance sort of the mythology of some of the narratives that maybe are passed down by families versus the military. It sounds like a lot of your sources are different kinds of military records, like passes and different things. Is there, I guess, in order to say your research is accurate, are the family stories, do they have to be corroborated in some way, or
We try. It depends. With everything, like it sort of depends. In terms of military service, we initially 100% required official military documentation of service for a guy to come into the database. And then we kept running into this situation where an entire regiment in Indiana, a number of regiments in Indiana, their records are missing. They're gone. We have no muster rolls for them. How do you say these guys didn't serve when you know for a fact it's just that the records don't exist? And then that problem is just amplified by a bazillion in the South where these official records either don't exist or they are sitting in someone's attic. They were burned. They're at a state archive that we are going to have to fly to, Montgomery, Alabama, or New Orleans to get to eventually. And we want to do that. And that is our plan. But we don't have all those resources at our disposal the way we do the federal records right now. So we do what we call inferred service. And that's basically if we have multiple sources saying, hey, this guy was a soldier, and we have an actual regiment they served in. They have to have a unit. We can't just generally be, we know my great-great-grandfather was a colonel in Kentucky. There's a lot of Kentucky colonels. Just read the obituaries. That Louis Mundheim story about him being a captain in all his obituaries, we see that all the time. So we do require actual evidence and multiple sources to corroborate things, but we have found ways to make sure we're including as many people as we can and not leaving someone out because they had the misfortune of being in that Indiana regiment whose records never made it back to the state house. So
yeah. I see a couple of other questions in the chat. One, have we come across any soldiers from Northern Virginia, especially Alexandria?
Yes, for sure. Alexandria is kind of an interesting area because it's under federal occupation for most of the Civil War. So you see kind of a cool mix of a lot of guys still going south and serving in Confederate regiments, but also some guys enlisting up for the Union. And it's going to be a really exciting story to tell when we have all the Confederate data. I'm excited to kind of, again, have that comparison of Union service from Northern Virginia versus Confederate service from Northern Virginia. I'm from Loudoun County, Virginia, in an area that remained loyal to the Union, even though Mosby raided here. So it's going to be a really interesting story when it all shakes out, but we don't have the data yet to go into detail.
That's what's so hard is there is so much, like, we want to talk about the families that were divided by the war. And
Yeah, that's
you know,
one
if
of our
you
favorite
think
things too.
about, you know, Maryland, there's
Yes.
some stories about the Civil War in Maryland that need to be told that
Absolutely.
haven't been told.
Well, Maryland is fascinating too, just because there were so few regiments fielded from Maryland because it is this border state, and it is so heavily contested, and it's under federal occupation for the whole war. But I think the sentiment was predominantly secessionist leaning. So the guys that we have served there from the Union, like Blumenberg, had a tough time keeping things together because they were really fighting against the grain and the people around them. So. Mhm.
One of the earlier questions I saw, did the soldiers face any anti-Jewish discrimination during their term of service? We definitely have evidence of that, but what we have found really striking is how much non-evidence we found. You know, there's just, it's a mixed bag. And definitely, if that's something you're interested in, Adam Mendelssohn's book on the Union soldiers covers a lot of those examples.
Deeply.
Yes,
Yeah, obviously order number 11 happens where
right.
Grant tries to expel all the Jews from the Western territories he's in charge of, which is horrific. And we have at least one soldier who resigned in protest of that
Yes.
movement. We have a couple of soldiers that deserted or resigned and said it was because they were facing anti-Semitism in their regiments, you know, that the people weren't treating them correctly. So we definitely see it. And we know, unfortunately, a lot of the guys don't talk about facing anti Semitism because it was probably part of their everyday normal existence, which is pretty crappy. But Adrian's right. One of the things we really like seeing and that we've seen so much of, and like just, I mean, volumes of it, are these accounts of non-Jews talking about their Jewish comrades and how great they think they are. And like, you know, well, it's the first Jew I'd ever met. You know, this guy, this is why I remember him. And like, he was so brave. He fought hard at this battle. And you see these lifelong friendships
Yes.
formed, and they continue having these relationships, you know, until their death. Like one of them's the pallbearer for the other one.
Yeah.
When our soldier lived in a Jewish neighborhood in New York City or, you know, DC, things like that, and really didn't go beyond that in any other aspect of his life, but he had these friendships he held on to from his service. So,
And one nice thing when we started on the project, one of the things we were told was that aliases used during the service was because of strictly either anti-Semitic experiences or just kind of prophylactically, like, you know. But
I'm
what
gonna
we
hide that I'm
found,
Jewish. You don't need to know.
right, exactly. But what we found is so many of them, if they were trying to hide by changing their name, they picked pretty Jewish sounding names for aliases, a lot of them.
Yeah.
And one of the things we like to say is that because we've compiled all the evidence, all the reasons given, and Jewish mothers then and Jewish mothers today, they did not want their
Everybody.
moms to worry. You know,
Yeah.
that's pretty much what
That
everybody
is
says.
without question the number one reason aliases were used in general during the Civil War, but certainly with our Jewish soldiers and sailors was they were hiding their service from their family. And it
Yeah.
was either because they were young and their family could have pulled them out of the service if the family found out that they were serving. So they're going against, you know, someone's wishes. They're 15, 16. That was a huge problem the Union Army had in general. Guys getting pulled out by their parents. Uh, so that there's that. But then there's also the aspect of so many of our soldiers are recent immigrants from Europe, other places, but predominantly Europe. And so these lists, these casualty lists were getting printed in Europe, like Gettysburg, the casualty list was printed in these German states. And these soldiers were like, if I die fighting in this war, I want my family back in Germany to think that I'm having this happy, great life. I don't want them to know I died somewhere, in rural Virginia. So that is definitely like 100% the main reason we see people using aliases. And I think we have maybe one or two instances where a guy actually says, "Hey, I did this because I didn't want people to know I was Jewish." That's a myth we really have busted.
Caitlin, that's an excellent lead in to the question. Have you encountered any Jewish veterans who were not U.S. citizens yet fought for either the North or South?
Lots. Oh my gosh, so many. It's not something we track directly. It's one of those like you look back and you're like, I wish I wrote down what year each guy became a citizen, an American citizen every time. Most of our
If we
guys don't
even
become
know.
citizens. If we even know, most of our guys didn't become citizens until after the war, I would say, pretty predominantly. And they expedited the process to become a citizen for veterans. So we have a lot of guys where you actually will see their service listed on their naturalization records, which is really cool. Um, but it was extremely common that these guys would get off the boat and it would be like, well, I can get $100 bounty check tomorrow if I enlist in this regiment and I don't have a job. So that sounds great. So we see a lot of our men serving as volunteers for American citizens, which is part of the reason we know for sure so many of these guys were not citizens or on their path to becoming citizens yet when they serve. And in the South, the Confederate Conscription Act starts in spring of 1862. And we have a lot of guys who enlisted in 1861 and then end up getting discharged because their regiment's term of enlistment gets extended 2 years, but they're ineligible for the Confederate Conscription Act because they are not citizens and they get dumped for being a foreigner. So we see a ton of that, which it's really fascinating too. So many of the guys we've looked at least in the Union, cite one of the reasons they come to America to avoid the Prussian draft because Prussia had mandatory service at age 20. So we have so many guys being like, I came over, I didn't want to serve in the Prussian army, and then I volunteered to serve in the Union army. And it really speaks to how much these guys were passionate about being American and sort of being a part of this giant movement that was happening. So
Another question, have we found evidence of Jewish women who served in the Union and Confederate causes? We wish.
somebody asks this every presentation,
I
and we're
know,
always like, we are dying to find this. If
right?
you help us unlock, like, I'll give you a giant check if you help us find this person because we would be so excited, but we
Yeah,
have
we
not
would.
found her yet. I am determined she exists, but we have
Yes.
not found her yet.
Yep, that's a fair assessment of that. Let's see. Somebody wrote, oh, do we know of likely Jewish names on the Pennsylvania Memorial at Gettysburg National Military Park? I don't
We
know.
definitely have some guys who died at Gettysburg or were wounded at Gettysburg for sure. And that is an easy search you can run in our database. If you want that search, email us and we will tell you exactly how to find everybody who was killed or wounded at Gettysburg, captured, any of it. Um, but I don't know the names on the memorial specifically off the top of my head. There are so many memorials at Gettysburg too. So
This is
I'm sure
specifically
you're
the Pennsylvania one.
the Pennsylvania one. Yeah, I'm sure we have some guys, but I cannot bring one up off the top of my head right now. But like I said, email us and we will tell you the search to run in our database and you can find them.
Another question, he was stationed, quote, means he was in the military or not?
Stationed. So that's tough.
I know.
Sounds most likely, but I will say the trap that we occasionally fall into is you have
Yeah.
civilian appointees to military jobs. So
Yeah.
like there are clerks in the quartermaster department who are not members of the military. They have no rank. They have no piece of paper that says they must serve X amount of time. They are just given this job. And sometimes it is called an appointment, which is very confusing. And that person could be stationed somewhere. So it is not a guarantee, but it is a likely in the military situation.
But I will say this, if you have somebody specifically that you are curious about, again,
Now,
email
we
us.
will look into it. We
We'll
will
look
go
into it.
digging. We will find you records, even if they were civilians. We could probably find you some records at the National Archives. We have a
Right.
connection. Like,
Another question is, what can you tell us about Colonel Edward S. Salomon, who fought at Gettysburg and other battles?
we love him.
We do.
He's great. So he served in the 82nd Illinois Infantry. And I am gonna give us a shout out about uh the 82nd Illinois Infantry has sometimes been referred to as the Jewish Regiment. It was not. That's okay. There
Yeah.
are a significant number of Jewish soldiers who served in it. It is a very cool regiment. And the reason that people thought it was a Jewish regiment and it got this reputation is the Concordia Club in Chicago, which is a Jewish fraternal group, raised the money to start forming, I think, Company A, all of
Companies.
it. Was it all?
No, Company C.
Companies A through
No,
Company C,
just C.
right. So it's
Just C.
Company C. So they had this company that was sponsored by this Jewish fraternal group, and they gave additional money to encourage people to sign
Big
up,
money.
volunteer for this company, like big time. People wanted to be in this company. And so that became the Jewish company for clear reasons. And then because Salomon was high up, there were several other Jewish officers in the regiment, including Salomon's brother-in-law, Joseph Greenhut. And so people sort of spun that idea again into myth and created the Jewish regiment, but it was not.
Right.
But very cool. And Salomon, like, great record of service. It's very cool. We have a lot of documents from him in our database. I definitely, like, whoever was asking about him, I definitely encourage you to check it out because we found some really cool stuff, especially in the 82nd regimental papers on him. So
For sure. A question, let's see. Let's see, which majigger. No, that was I got those. Okay. Was there another one in here? No, that was some comments. Let me see here. Did Grant show any bias or discrimination towards the Jews?
order number 11 happened. So yes. Yes. In later years, he tried to make up for it. He's the first US president to visit a synagogue. Sixth and I is the one he went to, right? Am I right about this,
Think so,
Adrian? I
yes.
think I'm right about this.
Yes.
Someone who's a better Grant scholar than me, please correct me if you're in the audience. But he was the first president to visit a synagogue. And he definitely supported some of the causes with like Russian area Jews coming over in the late 1860s and stuff because he said he regretted his actions during the Civil War. So
And Simon Wolf had a role to play in that because we like to think of Simon Wolf as a social justice warrior, and he just badgered Grant because he was just kind of all up in everybody, but he had many conversations with Grant, and whether he's the reason or not, he claims that he is in part responsible for Grant's reversal on his thinking. So another question wasn't there a high up Jewish officer in the Navy? Lots of them, actually.
yeah, we have a number of them. So you're probably thinking of Uriah P. Levy, who did we I think he's out. He's out by the time, or do we? No, we have him in. We have him in. He served like on a court-martial board
Yeah,
during the
exactly.
Civil War. Like he
Yep.
basically didn't serve, but he is very briefly serving for like a hot second during the Civil War, which is very cool. And so, of course, he is the Commodore who outlawed corporal punishment in the Navy. And then he goes on to buy Monticello, and his family are the ones who save Monticello from ruin, which is amazing. So a lot of people know about Uriah P. Levy. Here's my short. This is what you don't know about Uriah P. Levy, which is cool. He had two nephews who also served in the Civil War. One was his namesake. He serves for the Confederacy. And then Morton Levy Phillips serves for technically the U.S. Revenue, like the cutter service, which is now the Coast Guard. But he's like pretty high up and does impressive things during the Civil War. And he changed his name because he didn't want to be shown favoritism for being Uriah P. Levy's nephew, which is why he adopts Phillips as his last name. So they're really cool. You can't see the Confederate Uriah's record yet, but you can look up the other guy. You can look up Morton Phillips in our database. They're very cool. So
There's a comment here that it was the audience members' understanding that the Company C of the 82nd Illinois was primarily German and that Company C was primarily Jewish. It actually was not. We have researched everybody in Company C. Also,
I think there's like 30 guys though that are Jewish in the
yes.
company. There's a lot.
There's
There is
a lot.
a lot. Like it's a lot more than you normally find in
Yes.
one specific company anywhere
Right.
else, but the majority of the company was not Jewish.
Right. And the mythology around it, it's actually quite fascinating how it over time how the mythology was built, because at the time nobody thought of it as an all Jewish company, not even the guys in it, but anyway. And then also there's a comment here that Salomon's brother was also an officer in the regiment. This is the great Salomon mythology as well. There's another Edward S.
confusing. Yes.
Salomon, and he was in fact not Jewish, and his brothers who did serve
in the 82nd,
also not Jewish. But it's very, very confusing. And we have corresponded over the course of a decade with descendants of the non-Jewish Salomons. And they have been to, they've viewed the birth records, they've viewed the burials, they've, gone to Europe. But the thing is, the stuff is out there. And so it keeps getting perpetuated. But, let's see what else. This is not an explicit part of the project, but do you know of any Jewish women as nurses or relief workers or free people teachers? I believe
I did run into like this. So our problem with this is we have no way of tracking that information.
Right.
So like we have definitely anecdotally run into stories of like men meeting their wives because they were nurses or things like that. So yes, definitely there were Jewish nurses that we have encountered. Can I name them for you at this moment? No, unfortunately not. And that is definitely something we would love to work on in the future, for
Right.
sure, because obviously women's contribution to the Civil War is huge. So,
and that's another thing, when one of the things that we really want to happen with the Shapell roster is we want all of these questions. We want people to be inspired to come look at the data and tell the stories that they find. It's not just us.
data,
I mean,
sure.
that's why we have made all of this information, all of these documents and ourselves available to the public. We want scholars. We want everybody who's interested in the stories, because when I said the part about, we're trying to change the conversation from how many doesn't tell you anything about these men. And the stories, I mean, when I think of the stories we've read, I have goosebumps. I mean, they lived amazing lives. I can't believe how many of them lived to be in their 90s and hundreds after surviving the Civil War. That's crazy pants. I
Can't tell
can't,
you how many like almost centenarian obituaries we read where they talk about how they still had bullets in them,
yeah,
like that they carried for 70 years. And you're like, what? It's
you know,
incredible. So
and they immigrate by themselves at age 12, 13. They don't speak the language. They come over and they make it work. It's amazing. I mean, these people are just resilient. And it's, yeah. So that's, that's one of the reasons we're like, please come read the stories, read the documents, when Caitlin
tell
said,
us what we don't know. If we're missing something, please.
right,
Like
right.
we look at
And
so many guys in a day, if this guy is your ancestor, if this guy is your passion project and you know things about a soldier that we don't have, tell us because
right,
we want to make
absolutely.
sure we're accounting for these guys as best as we possibly can. So
And I don't know who all's in the audience, but kids today aren't learning how to read handwriting, right? So when Caitlin said the part about if you're interested in volunteering, we read handwriting all day long. Occasionally we're like, all right, group consensus, what's this word? But we're pretty good at reading handwriting. But a lot of the public isn't. And so we would love it if people wanted to come and just transcribe these documents so that everybody
sure.
can enjoy them. You know what I
And they're
mean?
searchable.
Yeah, and then we can make them searchable. Although,
Yeah.
with the way AI is going, and the ability to transcribe handwriting blew my mind. But I'm an old fashioned like that. I still think, humans need to do that. Let me see if there's another question here. Do you have any information about a Union officer, I believe a captain, named Loventhal that served in Nashville and married a Jewish woman from Nashville and remained there?
It sounds extremely familiar. We definitely have multiple Leventhals in the database. So definitely go look. I cannot pull this person off the top of my head at this moment. Like we said, we've been pretty deep in Confederate guys right now, for the most part. But definitely run a search. And if you're not finding him, definitely reach out to us because we can help you.
Is
And
this
we'd
the
love to talk to you
guy
more.
that A. Franklin wrote about? That I think it's very familiar.
Maybe.
Daniel, absolutely. Email us at roster@shapell.org and let's track this down. We can do that.
100%.
Yep. I don't, Matt, tell me if I missed any questions. Oh, there was one about Marcus Spiegel. Honestly, the book about him, the treatment about him in Adam Mendelssohn's book, I mean, I think they do a pretty comprehensive job. But the one thing I will
Check
say,
out Gene Soman's book too, with all the
yes,
letters. Gene
exactly.
Somans is Marcus Spiegel's descendant, and she
Yes.
wrote a very lovely book with all his correspondence between him and his wife. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, we like Marcus Spiegel a lot. We think he's a cool guy. We have a
It's a shame.
pretty good
It's a shame
we
that
have a pretty
nobody
good
knows where he's
article.
buried.
Yeah, that we've tried to figure out where along the Red River his body is buried, which is where he allegedly was buried, and have never made a ton of headway on that front. But
Yeah.
we do have an article on him on the website as well.
Yes, we do.
So definitely check that out. It's pretty cool. It's about his evolving views on slavery. So
Yeah. Which
definitely
is,
ties in nicely with the presentation you guys are having next week. So
yes, exactly. No, in fact, we should reference that. It's very poignant. What I like about it is he has these ideas, and we all have ideas, and then he comes face to face with the reality. And as he's writing his wife, he's like, I don't want to see this reality. And then he's like, I can't not see this reality. It's very,
Yeah, I mean, basically to summarize for people who don't know about Spiegel, which is probably a lot of people, he was an officer in an Ohio regiment, and he starts out being pretty anti-Lincoln, pretty anti-abolitionist. He's sort of like, this isn't really my problem, and I don't want to fight this war for these reasons. And then he sees slavery as he travels south fighting and is horrified by what he sees and becomes a pretty ardent and like, I don't know, he isn't like published as an abolitionist, but he's pretty ardent in his abolitionist views that slavery needs to end and it's, you know, a blight. So,
yeah. And this is a great question. Who are our personal favorite Jewish Civil War heroes? Okay, we love you, Gary Kamen. We love that question.
That's a nice,
You go
it
first.
should be a softball, but there's too many guys.
No, right? So many.
Yeah, I would say so. I don't want to say this is my favorite because I can't pick a favorite. But one of my favorites that is like an early tie-in. We have a captain who was murdered on duty, Ferdinand Levy. I'm
Levy.
saying this and now I'm like I'm getting his name wrong.
No, you're
Ferdinand
right.
Levy. And
And
I
he's
worked on
buried
him.
in DC.
That's what I was gonna say. So I worked on him really early in my tenure with the project. Um, and it's this very sad story where he basically goes to break up a fight in the middle of the night. And the troop at the time was stationed in DC, waiting to kind of get their next assignment. And he goes to break up this fight, and one of the guys is drunk and is like waving around a bayonet and ends up killing our guy. And then there's this whole story about getting him a Jewish burial and all the efforts that happened to like make sure he received a Jewish burial. He was from a New York regiment, so he's not near home at the time. And he gets buried in the Washington Hebrew Congregation Cemetery. So he's in the old portion of that cemetery. And I thought the story was really fascinating to begin with, but we went on a very early field trip out to the Washington Hebrew Congregation Cemetery, and I found his grave, and it was like this very kind of full circle, like, wow, this is the gravity of what we're doing. This is our job. Yeah. That really hit me. And so he's one that sticks with me. And like not necessarily for any great heroism, but he was just a guy trying to do his job. And, you know, he's there and he's real.
I mean, one of the casualties of doing the work that we do is we remember these incredible stories and then we remember names, but we don't often
put them together.
Right. So like the story Caitlin just told, that's a rarity for us because we'll remember, like this one story and then can't put the name to it, and then we'll remember a guy's name, but we can't remember the story that goes with him. But I would have to say, and to us, having not served in the military, they're all heroes to me. The patriotism, the dedication, the bravery, the things that they put up with, and then, like I said, lived full lives afterwards. I'm just in awe. I mean, they lost limbs. So to me, they're all incredibly brave. One of my favorite stories, and we have a story about him on our website, is this guy named Edmund Zelinsky. And Edmund Zelinsky is kind of like this Forrest Gump guy where he just moves through history and he's in the right
keeps
place.
Showing up places.
Yeah, he's in the right place, the right time. He meets the right people. And, his DC connection is that he was friends with, or he befriended Winslow Homer, who was on assignment as an artist, for Harper's Magazine. So Winslow Homer's, making pictures of the war, because we don't have photos. And they become friends. And years later, Winslow Homer sends Zelensky a bunch of sketches that he made that he never turned into Harper's Magazine. And he was like, these should be familiar to you, because it was when he was stationed with the regiment that Zelensky was with. And so Zelensky ends up passing those down. And they were recently donated to the National Gallery of Art, who has the largest Winslow Homer collection. But they were previously unknown drawings. And so if you go to the National Gallery of Art's website, they have a whole page dedicated to these Winslow Homer things.
And Zelensky's really cool too. He was 12 when he gets into the military, which is insane. Like he was a schoolboy and he saw the regiment out forming, and he ran up and was like, I'm coming with you. And by 14, he was a lieutenant. So apparently he was a very talented preteen, because you know, they're commissioning him.
And there's this photo at the Library of Congress that we were able to, it's the officers of the regiment that he was in. And there's a photo, and we were able to deduce by virtue of age and the fact that he's wearing the Officer of the Day sash, right? But not only that, he stays in the military. And he ends up on he ends up, and I'm blanking, it's where they sent Samuel Mudd.
He's down in the Dry Tortugas. Yeah, he's stationed down working in the Dry Tortugas, and he meets Samuel Mudd, the doctor.
Samuel Mudd gets sentenced to a life of hard labor for his role in Lincoln's assassination.
Participated in Lincoln's assassination. He's the doctor who treated Booth afterwards too, like trussed up his leg after Booth breaks his leg.
And there's a yellow fever epidemic at Dry Tortugas, and Samuel Mudd, he's a doctor. He ends up treating everybody, even though he's a captive. And Zelensky starts a petition, and that's why Samuel Mudd got to leave Dry Tortugas and eventually go home. Otherwise, he was going to be there till the day he died. So, like I said, Zelensky he's like this Forrest Gump guy. He just keeps moving through history.
Not a lot of people you've heard of.
Right. So anyway, but that would be, those are just some of the stories that you can find in the Shapell roster. I don't see any other questions. So
thank you so much. I think those stories were a wonderful way to end this conversation. They were so fun. And I have 2 preteens myself, and I can't imagine that situation at all.
Right? Oh my gosh, wild. Yes.
Or I guess one of them is actually a teenager. I still can't imagine it. She's 14 now, so it's crazy what they experienced. And hearing these narratives is really wonderful. And thank you. And I'm sure everyone out there, enjoyed hearing them, and hopefully they'll go on and do their own research. I'm actually interested myself, as I mentioned, before we came on, that my family came around the Civil War time. So I'm interested in at least uncovering whether or not any of them played a role in the war.
Absolutely. So. Send us some names. We will go
Reach
looking.
Out. We love doing that.
We love a lead. So
exactly.
Thank you. Yeah. So again, thank you so much. And thank you all out there for joining us.
Thank you everyone for coming out on a Thursday night virtually.
Yep. If nothing else, it was something else to think about, for an hour or so. So thank you so much for your interest. We really appreciate it.
Have a good night.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you,
everybody.
Bye-bye.